In our next edition of Screen Talk, we'll be talking to Bradford-born writer and producer Michael Hirst about his long career in film and television and the phenomenal success of the TV historical drama series Vikings, which was inspired by the sagas of Viking king Ragnar Lothbrok, one of the best-known Norse heroes. The show has become a huge hit in many areas of the world. Michael talks about his approach to writing and some of the challenges of bringing legendary characters to life. Ladies and gentlemen, would you give a very warm Bradford welcome to Michael Hirst?
Sugar plum fairies.
Welcome to Bradford. Welcome back to Bradford. So thank you, first of all, for making the trip back to Bradford. And it's a real honour and a privilege to have you here. I've got lots and lots of questions, and I'm sure that members of the audience will as well. So if you don't mind, Can we dive straight in there with, and we will cover other things. But Vikings, I've got to say, what a delight it was for me to discover that you were actually from Bradford. So as we were researching people that we could invite for these screen talks, Jane, our colleague from the office, had said, Michael Hirst is from Bradford. And I'm going, get away. And so we had to really get you here. So thanks for coming. And I've got to ask at this stage, what a success. I mean, what a phenomenal success. Did you ever have any idea about how successful Vikings would be at the start of the journey?
No, you're never sure. It's always a journey into the unknown when a show starts. And it's always a precarious journey anyway, because it then depends on audiences. So if a show, even if it perhaps starts strongly, if the audiences fall off at some point, it's a ruthless business and they'll just cancel the show. So I didn't, for those reasons, obviously know that it was going to be a hit. But I had a sense that perhaps it might be because everybody knows about Vikings. I mean, they know the wrong. Do now. They know the wrong things about Vikings. Yeah. I mean, they think that they were all rapists and pillagers and things. But when I was trying to sell it to the History Channel, and they said, well, and this is in New York, and they said, well, what's the relevance to us here? And I said, walk 2 blocks around here, just out of the office, and you'll meet 200, 300 people with Viking DNA. The Vikings got everywhere. They were certainly here. York was a Viking city. We shoot the show in Dublin, which is a Viking, or just outside Dublin, which is a Viking city. The Vikings influenced our laws. They influenced many things about the way we live. So, and when I was talking to the History Channel, who show it in the States, they said, how do you think we should publicize the show? I said, you put a huge billboard up on Sunset Boulevard and you just write the word Vikings. Because as soon as you say the word Vikings, it brings to mind visceral images. So I was hopeful, but I could never have estimated or guessed how huge it actually was going to be.
And remind me, how many countries?
200 now.
Wow.
200. So the second biggest in demand show in the world, behind The Walking Dead, but in front of Game of Thrones.
Fantastic.
Which I believe is a fantasy.
That's incredible, isn't it? And I think you're right about when you mentioned DNA. I mean, in Yorkshire as well. Yeah, like you said, you mentioned York, but I feel it. I have an urge to be near the sea sometimes. And when we're in Bradford, we're 82 miles away from the nearest coastline or something like that. And even going to Filey on a weekend, I do turn into slight Viking mode. There's something about that attraction of being near the ocean that is really kind of captivating.
So many of our villages and places are named, have Viking names. It's quite extraordinary.
So can we come on to authenticity for a while? Because actually, I was a latecomer.
Yeah, right.
I was a latecomer to the show, as in season 1 had already aired, and it was my wife that said, we've got to watch this show because it's supposed to be the true story of the Vikings.
Right.
And that's what sparked for me, and it was like, okay, we'll watch it. Well, let's see. And you know what? We talked about this, finding time to watch shows often in busy schedules, and you've got it all on demand. But then I was hooked from the get-go. And in terms of that authenticity, and I read a lot about after that, it made me do a bit of research about how much information had actually been destroyed by the church and other people. So was it really difficult to get to what is as near to the truth as you can?
How long have you got? All right. So, the Viking Age, it was in what are called the Dark Ages. Okay, so there is a limited amount of information. And most of the Vikings are non-literate society. They didn't write down anything. So most of what we know about them was written down by their enemies. That's Christian monks, occasional Arab traders. I mean, we have the sagas. We have, we have Saxon accounts of the battles, and I live in Oxfordshire, and a lot of the battles were around where I live. So there is a fair amount of historical material, not as much, obviously, as the Tudors, where there's probably too much. But that brings you to the question of accuracy. For me, there's no such thing as historical accuracy, in the sense of you ask any two historians, professional historians, about any event in history, and they would disagree about how it happened. And that's not surprising. Things look different from different points of view and from different. And I'm also not making a documentary. If I was making a documentary, I'd say, well, on the one hand, and on the other hand, so I've got a drama and I've got to entertain people, because it could be as accurate as you like, but if no one's watching it, who cares? But I do think I have a historical advisor. So I do a lot of research myself. He gives me a lot of research. I take the research for a walk. I mean, I've got these great characters. I've got Ragnar Lothbrok. I've got his sons. They're real people. They were real people. But I have to put them in dramatic situations or develop dramatic situations I know they were in. And I ask my historical advisor, first of all, whether what I'm writing is plausible. With everything he knows about these people, is it plausible? Is it authentic? Does it have regard to what we know about their customs, behaviors, tactics? Does it ring that bell? And is it truthful? And truthful is that's a dodgy kind of a difficult sort of quality, in a sense. But I think that if you're dealing with things that really happen with people that really lived, you have a responsibility as a writer to be as truthful as you can be. And I do, and I say this, and people hate me for it anyway, but I do draw this distinction between Game of Thrones and Vikings, that because Game of Thrones is a fantasy, anything can happen. So dead people can come back to life, or dragons can fly, And because, I'm not saying it's bad, it's great, it's great television. But because anything can happen, it's actually meaningless, because it doesn't obey any of the laws of geography or biology or anything. And I'm very proud of the fact that Vikings is real, or at least it's based on real people and real events. And we make it as real as we can. So we don't use much green screen. Our actors actually drag boats uphill and row and fight and go on horses. So it's a very real undertaking.
Yeah, and there's no dragons. I mean, the final season of Game of Thrones, I know we said before, maybe you didn't catch it, but just the Hollywood sort of, anyway.
I don't, as a point of, I don't watch other shows. And one of the reasons I don't watch other shows is I don't want to be influenced, and I don't want anyone ever to accuse me of being influenced.
Okay.
So,
that's interesting. Can I ask you, it's just the length of time of Vikings and the Tudors compared to writing for a feature film.
Yeah.
So with Elizabeth, 2 hours, 4 minutes. Is the approach so much more daunting when you're going into something that is kind of could be perceived as never ended, 6 series?
Well,
where do you start with that? I mean,
I went into it, certainly I went into Tudors as a kind of television virgin. I had never written for TV before. I didn't know whether I could do it. The long form, that is, one episode after another, one season after another. I think we did 37 episodes of Tudors. But what actually happens in a movie, and I spent a long time working in movies, and most of the things I wrote never got made. Elizabeth was my kind of breakthrough movie. But you've got an hour and a half, 2 hours with the main character and main characters. And your job is really to reveal the characters, to reveal the truth of the character. In a TV show, and I've now written 89 episodes of Vikings, so I have a lot of time with my main characters, and they can be developed. And you can expose contradictions in them. You can explore. You can go down little alleyways with them. You can find out about them. It becomes like a two-way street that you are working with the character, and then you're working with the actor who plays the character, and it's a joy. I mean, it's creative joy. It's absolutely fantastic. But the other great thing is, when I was writing Tudors and Vikings, I knew that everything I wrote would be made and it would be on the screen. When I was writing movie scripts, I knew basically that it was more than likely wouldn't end up on the screen.
So you bring me to my next kind of subject in a way, which is about relationships, and what is so kind of every film or TV series has these dynamics of the relationships. But I think with Vikings in particular, you've got kind of Ragnar and his relationship with Flogi the boat builder, then with Lagertha, then with King Egbert, and the relationship, then the sons, and those complex relationships. I wonder, how do you lay it all out? I mean, you may be giving trade secrets here away, but how do you mind map where those complexities within relationships come? Because for me, as much as the theme and the DNA, like you say, of Vikings and the bloody battles and the way that it looks and the authenticity, the brilliance of it is in those kind of complex web of relationships, and King Egbert are just, what a fantastic character, and his relationship with the monk, and then with Ragnar, and with Judith. God bless Judith.
Linus Roach is a great actor.
And son of Ken Barlow, by the way. Did everyone know that? Of course you did. Of course you did. Sorry, But so relationships, and is that a key part of your absolute process of?
To create drama, you put together two disparate personalities or two people who believe different things. And by the way, the Huffington Post said that Vikings is one of the few shows on American television that takes religious belief seriously, so that the pagan Christian conflict inside Vikings is one of the most powerful motors of it. But the energy between characters, conflicts and loves between characters also drives it. And the most difficult episode to write is the first episode, because you're introducing your main characters, Ragnar, his brother, Floki, Lagertha, the family, and you don't want to put too much detail in. You don't want to put too little. You want to engage the audience with them, and if you can do that, then you've set the stage to be able to take it further. Because you've got the audience on side, or at least they're interested in these characters. And it was one of my ambitions was to show that instead of just being rapists and pillagers and rather dirty looking hippies, the Vikings were culturally fascinating and sophisticated, and that, wouldn't you know, they had family lives. husbands love their wives, and husbands' wives love their children. And I started. So the first scene was a battle scene, a very short battle scene. Okay, this is the world of Vikings. You're going to see a lot of this, shot hopefully in a visceral and interesting way. The second scene is a domestic scene with Ragnar and his family. So, okay, this isn't the Vikings you know. So got over that hump, hopefully got people interested. And then introducing new characters, new dynamics. They came out of historical research. Harold Finehair or whoever it was, all bringing something to the show. And then the actors bringing a lot to their roles.
And I've got a few questions about the casting, which I'll come on to. But about so the role of women in society. Again, the strong characters, the strong female characters, the shield maidens, the shield wall, and again, presuming all of that is based on some form of historical accuracy.
It's very important for me to have female characters in my dramas. In fact, the Tudors is actually not really about Henry VIII. It's about his wives, because I thought that history had dealt them bad hands, that they'd been very badly treated by historians. So Lagertha, for example, in Vikings, very important character. And I'd read in the sagas, it said there were shield maidens, women who fought with their husbands, fathers, and brothers in the shield wall. I also knew that women had a very significant role in Viking society. They could rule. They could buy property. They could divorce their husbands. The people who destroyed all those rights that women had were Christians. So I was very keen to introduce this woman who was a real powerhouse, who did fight, who was a great warrior, and quite a few historians, gave me a hard time. They said, actually not Scandinavian historians, by the way, but they said it can't be true. How could women fight in the shield wall? How could they really match up to Viking men? And one of the things that pleased me most of all was a few years ago, there's a famous Viking grave called the Warrior Grave, which is in Sweden, I think. I don't know. Anyway, we know he's a warrior because he's surrounded by all his weapons and his shield, and he was buried on his own. So he was clearly a significant and totemic figure. And the museum where all these artifacts, his artifacts and probably his bones are, actually, the curator changed about 3 years ago, and the curator's a woman. And she looked at the bones, and she said, that ain't a man, that's a woman. So they did DNA, they did lots of tests. So the great Viking warrior is a woman. So although I can say to historians, and by the way, I haven't received the abuse on Vikings that I did on Tudors, but so that's another thing. But I could say, you may disagree, but I have some proof. And also, by the way, this is what I believe.
And it's brilliant. And in a way, it feels, that also feels quite contemporary in a way, where even though we're watching something, from the dim and distant past, it kind of feels quite contemporary with the shield maidens and Lagertha.
Yeah, I kind of feel that it's my job to connect the past to the present. Partly because, I believe with T.S. Eliot that the past and the future are all contained in time present. And after all, we all live in history. I've never really believed in this, that there are sort of historical things and there are contemporary things, because the things we call contemporary will be historical very soon, And but it was hard initially. Showtime in the States were interested in doing Henry VIII, but the head of Showtime, who liked Elizabeth, but he said, Michael, we have a problem, because in Middle America, people just don't like to see movies about or shows about men in tights, So what makes it relevant? In what ways is it going to resonate with people today? And I said, look, okay, think of this guy. He's 22 years old. he happens to be the son of a king, but imagine that he's the son of the chairman of Ford Motors, and he has an elder brother who's going to become the chairman or the king, and he's going to go in the church or some other load because that's what second sons did, and then suddenly his brother dies, and then soon afterwards his father dies, and he's the king. He's the chairman of the company. There are two other companies, by the way, who want to take over this company and can see a way now of doing it because he's vulnerable and he's a kid, and they're Chrysler and they're whatever, or they're France and they're Spain. And also, he's just got married. His father forces him to marry his brother's fiancée before he died. So and who was older than he was. So so he's got this older wife already, but he can do whatever he likes. He can just snap his fingers and ask for something, and it'll be given. He can do anything. So I said to Bob Greenblatt, head of show, does that get you anywhere? Can you see that it might be interesting for your young male audience to think that there could be something relevant there?
And he went for it.
He went for it. Yeah.
Oh, it's fantastic. And I want to just pick up on something you said as a historian about what we might be writing about in the future. So if we fast forward, gosh, even if there's going to be a human race in 100 years' time, who knows? And there's still a horrible histories type thing. What would the sorts, will we be talking about how they used to drive around in these metal boxes and poison everyone with the fumes, or, how everyone believed everything they read on the internet? What will be the history of, what will be the stuff that people will want to focus on for the first 20 years of this century?
I've no idea. And I think that the philosopher William James said that the experience of life for a young child, for a baby, and is a buzzing, booming chaos. And that's what I feel about my sense of contemporary life is a buzzing, booming chaos in which you don't know what's going to happen. You can never judge what's going to happen. And you just hope that it's going to be all right, okay, for your kids. But at least if something has already happened, you can have an overview of it. Yeah. You can judge it. You can put it in context, and you can measure it against other things. So, and I had a very academic background. So the research element of it, I can spend 2 years researching a show, and I just love that. I love that experience.
So let me ask you now a little bit about the casting, if I may, because do you get involved in the casting as the writer? So I just want to list a few names here, if I might. Apart from the brilliant writing, of course, and the way, the partnerships, that it's the casting as well, isn't it? So in the Tudors, you've got Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, who we also see reprised in Vikings, as a sword wielding bishop. Yeah. Catherine Winnock, who I believe is a black belt in, is it Taekwondo?
Yes.
So she had the fighting skills. Gustav Skarsgård, who plays Flogi. Yeah. How tall is Flogi in real life? He must be 6'7". Is he 6'8"?
Listen, when I go on the set of the Vikings, all the guys are about 7'3". I mean, it's.
Apart from your leading man there, the brilliant Travis Fimmel, who Australian. I mean, how did you find him? What was the secret behind that coming?
Well, it was an interesting process, the whole casting thing, because I had very firm ideas about the two leads. And one of the things I said, when I've seen Vikings on movies before, they're always shouty people. They're loud people with big people with red beards, and they shout all the time. And actually, they're Scandinavians, and my experience of Scandinavians is they don't. They're very quiet and considered and intelligent. I want a Viking who's going to be quite quiet, Okay. And so they still gave me lots of sort of Brian Blessed people, It was absolutely extraordinary. Yeah, like there has to be this huge guy and everything. So we really were in trouble because they wanted to give it the green light. They liked the scripts they wanted, but I rejected everybody. And they said, what the hell, because there comes a point when they start spending money. And when they start spending money, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars a day. So they are a bit panicky at that point, and unfortunately they gave me the power because I was what's called a showrunner. So I could actually block things. So they regretted that very much.
Thank God they did, though. Thank God they did.
Well, yeah, but then we got a self-tape. Just ended up, I was working with a great director, young director, who hadn't done very much up to that point, called Johan Renck, who's now done Chernobyl. He was the director of Chernobyl.
Which is brilliant, by the way. If you've not seen Chernobyl, one of the best things I've seen on television.
So he's gone on from strength, but this was one of his first things. And Travis sent a tape of himself in his kitchen of his farmhouse in the outback, with a T-shirt and an Australian hat. And he didn't pretend to have any kind of Scandinavian accent. And he also, between everything he said, it was like a minute's pause. It was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And he has these incredible eyes. So you're watching his eyes because he doesn't need to talk. And actually, when I was writing things for him, he would say, "Can you cut those lines, mate? I'll just show that, Okay. So, but a similar thing with Lagatha, that we were offered, so to speak, a lot of these beautiful young English actresses. I said, but Lagatha's killed so many guys in a shield wall. I mean, she's had 2 children. She lives in Viking society. She measures up to these guys, And someone said, a woman executive at one of the companies said, there's a woman called Catherine Winnick, who actually her job initially was to train other women to fight on screen because she's a black belt in Taekwondo. She's done a couple of small things, but never got anywhere. And I said, I really think I'll have to talk to her, but I really think that's the right way to go because she's going to be plausible when she fights. And that we go back to what is that plausible? Does that seem real? Does it seem truthful? And she's been amazing. She was amazing.
And I suppose having someone that wasn't fearful of fighting as well, that could take the odd punch or kick or wielding of a sword.
Yeah.
Going back to Ragnar and those long pauses and rolling eyes, and gosh, that was the gripping stuff, really, for me. Reminiscent a little bit of Jack Nicholson in The Shining. That kind of sense of sort of madness, and you don't know what you're going to do next. So that was on his audition tape. That's
that's beyond method.
Having written so brilliantly, handing over to a director, or in this case, a range of directors for Vikings, because there's been many. And is that
each one does 2 episodes?
Is that intentional?
Then?
So you're not sticking with the one.
Well, it's partly studios do it so the directors don't get any power. On a movie, the director is all powerful. But I believe in collaboration. Certainly, when you're making TV, I was working with brilliant people, and I like to delegate, so I like directors too. So I would very happily work with them, and it enriched the script. I always felt that the script could be better. I always do feel that scripts can be better.
So are there occasions? Are you on set for most of the time?
No.
You're not on set.
No.
So are there occasions where what you thought was going to happen and now you'd envisage this siege or this particular scene? Are you often surprised and delighted when you see it played back? Are you ever disappointed and think that's not how? That's just not how I saw it?
I have to say that there were certain movies made of scripts of mine early in my career, and I was genuinely disappointed in all of them. And whatever was happening in the screening room of my mind wasn't happening on the screen, and it was very disappointing. And it was partly because probably the scripts weren't that good, but also the director just takes them away from you. You're not even welcome on the set. With Vikings, I'm constantly delighted and surprised with what happens. People bring their best game to it, and I try and empower them to do that. So
So you've never been tempted to do a cameo or anything?
I did a cameo. It was disastrous. In the Tudors, one of the directors said, "Come on, Michael, do a little cameo, do your Alfred Hitchcock." And I said, "I'll only play the lowest of the low." Okay. And he said, "Well, there's a great scene you've written, which is there's a Catholic ceremony, which they don't do anymore. It's called crawling to the cross at Easter. So everyone in the church would crawl on their hands and knees, high and low, rich, poor, would crawl on their knees up to the priest, who would sit in front of the altar with a cross, and they would all kiss the cross." So I was in the scene, and I crawled. I was dressed as a peasant. I crawled. One of the, as they told me afterwards, one of the most devout Catholics we have ever seen on screen. I was loving this cross, and I devoutly kissed it, and they did rub it down with something to sort of clean it after everyone kissed it. But two things happened after that. One was that my scene was cut. And the second thing was that the day afterwards, my eye blew up, and I'd got this infection, and I had to go on a plane to Los Angeles looking like a pirate, So I never did that again. I just accumulate as many books as I can find, either in print or out of print. And I just read with a completely open mind. So I have no structure to my reading or my research. What I'm looking for are things that I don't know what I'm looking for, but they may be hints and insights into the characters. So if you're writing about Henry VIII, we all have an image of Henry VIII. When he was younger, Henry VIII was known as the handsomest prince in Christendom. There's loads of things that English people who think of him as a great sort of star, don't know about. And I'm looking for some ways of making him human, this young 22-year-old king. And I found a lot of material in footnotes, for example. So at one stage, this was on a different project. When I was writing Elizabeth, I needed to find an angle into her life, a way of talking about her that people hadn't talked about so far. I was doing all this reading, and my historical research was feeding other things. And actually, on that occasion, I got a strip of wallpaper, and I was just jotting down ideas, footnotes, poems. I use poetry a lot, so Thomas Wyatt and all the poets of the time, the music of the time I was listening to. And it's like a jumble. It's like the poet Dryden said, the act of creation are ideas and thoughts tumbling over each other in the darkness. And so I was allowing this tumbling to go on, and I was trying to see if something emerged, if a form emerged, if a storyline emerged. And actually, sure enough, it did, which pointed completely to before Elizabeth I was iconic, before she was safe in power, when she was a young woman, when she went in the Tower of London, when she was in fear of her life, when she was in love with Robert Dudley. Lots of things that were margins in historical accounts of her, but to me made her very human. So this length of wallpaper, which is someone has framed, I think now, but the story emerged sort of organically from that. So I have no method particularly. Obviously my historical advisor does have a method and is much more disciplined than I am. But and of course it's always a process. It's a process that carries on. If you're writing 89 episodes, you're discovering new things all the time. You're digging away all the time. So it's a process.
And just off the back of that, do you use software? Do you use these, the script software that you can get? Is a lot of it handwritten, typed? Like you said, the wallpaper.
There's something
cross-referencing system.
There's something called Final Draft.
So
I use Final Draft, and I send emails, and that's the only thing I can do on a computer. Sorry.
No, it's good to know. It's good to know. We were talking about Final Draft just the other day, and
it's just very useful. It's a tool.
You can put post-it notes on it, and pictures and all sorts. Yeah.
I suppose that I've been doing it long enough that I probably do have a method, but I don't know what it is. But you know, if you're dealing with characters on a daily basis, I'm living with these characters, and it's almost as if I go into my workspace and I say, well, what have you been up to? You know, and I tell you a story about that, actually, that's more truthful than that. Is my mentor was a film director who died last year called Nick Rogue, who did Don't Look Now, The Man Who Fell to Earth, some of the greatest performance. If you don't know Nick Rogue and you're interested in movies, you have to go. He's the best British cinematographer, actually, and director of the 20th century, much greater than David Lean. He worked as a cinematographer for David Lean, actually. And due to certain circumstances, I met him. I had no particular interest in film. I didn't think of film as a career. I was going to be an academic. I always wrote. I wrote short stories, and he read some of my short stories, and he said, I want you to write a script for me. And I said, I don't know how to write a script. He said, fantastic, you know, you have no bad habits. And he had a project, a J.M. Barrie play, and we discussed it for a while. And then he said, I want you to go away and write a couple of scenes for me. And so I said, great. And at the time, I was doing a PhD in the short stories of Henry James. So the two scenes I wrote, I thought they were exquisite. I mean, they were like two, perhaps even three people in a room, really delicately but deeply discussing some subject. Fantastic. I gave these scenes to Nick. He read the first one quite slowly, but then he speeded up somewhat. And then he opened the window and he threw them out of the window. So that was, you know, that's a strange induction. And I said, okay, well, what do I have to do to make you read my stuff, or what do you want? And he said, I want you to astonish me. And even though he died, he died last year, every morning when I'm writing a new scene for Vikings or whatever it is, I think of Nico, and I think, what I'm writing, would that astonish him, or at least would it engage him? Would it interest him? And so I have this process, I suppose, which is actually no more, no less than taking the dog for a walk in the morning, because I've left the script at a certain point the evening before. I think I've worked things out. I know where the characters are going to go. I know what the scene's about. But walking for an hour or so in the morning, I go over it in my mind and I think, can I do better than that? Can I introduce another element into the scene that makes it more interesting or complex, or make it more exciting for me to write it? The worst thing is to be bored if you're writing something or get stuck. I mean, if you're stuck, you should just drop it altogether. You're in the wrong, you're doing the wrong thing. But you want to kind of excite yourself, your imagination. And so often I get back and I sit down and I write a totally different scene. And then I hope that wherever he is, Nico likes that, you know?
That is such good advice to it. And I know there's a few filmmaking students in the audience. If you're bored with what you're making, it's going to be a bit boring. So that's a really good tip. Do you wake up at night often and think that's got to change? Do you have a notepad and do you have a notepad and pen at the side of the bed? I mean,
no,
you don't do that.
No. Yeah. Sometimes, of course, I wake up and I go, oh, yesterday. I'm processing. I'm aware of processing, and it is, I was doing Vikings for 8 years, really day and night, 7 days a week. I mean, it was a big strain, and I'm not going to show run again. It's too much, but because it becomes part of your system, it becomes part of your psychology, your whole, it's there. and you want to have other things, thoughts and everything, but it's not that I didn't resent that, because it was a fantastic experience, but it's over. Well, it seemed to the Vikings themselves, of course, went to so many countries around the world. I mean, I didn't know when I started that they went around the Mediterranean, that the Roman Emperor's Varangian Guard in Constantinople was made of Vikings, that they went into the Sahara, that they traded around the Mediterranean, that Russia is called Russia because it was founded by Rus Vikings. Vikings is extremely popular in all the places they went to, and left indelible marks. But it's also hugely popular in Brazil, where they never went. Yeah, I know. So I think as far as the TV show goes, it just did what TV shows are supposed to do. It had a leading character or leading characters who people identified with, empathized with. They weren't particularly nice people, but they were compulsively watchable people, and they were doing really interesting things. It took people, an audience, into a world they hadn't been before. People were suddenly, they didn't know that they were going to be interested in paganism, but suddenly they were fascinated by pagan rituals and pagan beliefs. It also made them perhaps think about their own Christian beliefs if they have them. So it's immersive, and as a drama, I'd like to think that it's very sure-footed. It never makes you wince. It never takes you out of that world.
I don't know, some of the battle scenes.
Some of the yes, there are. Yeah.
It's very well done.
Yeah, I think it's very well made. The production values are very, very high. It's very expensive to make. It's about, by the time we were finishing, we were spending $8 million an episode. And if you compare that the BBC did War and Peace for £2 million, so you're in a different ballgame. We had battles with 900 extras. We had more cameras shooting the attack on Paris than Spielberg had in Saving Private Ryan. So the scale of it is huge. The ambition of it is huge. And I think it's because it's about real things.
Well, what's next for you then, Michael? What have you got projects in the pipeline?
I have got projects. It's even for me, it's really hard to get anything going, partly because of the expense. But I've got a project about the English Civil War with the producer of Peaky Blinders. I wanted to do Dr. Zhivago, but that's been a very hard sell. And various other things at various stages. But I still have to go, like everyone else, I go into meetings, I have to pitch things, It's still the same for me all these years later.
And it's quite disheartening, but at the same time, I suppose it's quite refreshing to know that this is what has to happen. Do remember us, when you're doing some of these things. We've got some cracking locations.
Yeah, I know.
And
a round window, particularly.
We've got a great round window in City Hall. I'll show you. I've been talking about the round window in the toilets in City Hall, which no one's used. I show everyone that comes to look around. No one's used it, but somebody will very soon. Before we wrap up, you did a little interview with the Telegraph and Argus, the local newspaper, and I think Emma Clayton was the journalist, asked about maybe writing something that was kind of maybe set in Bradford. And I know you've got kind of a rich heritage, your own family in Bradford, but I just want to do a lift pitch, if I might, just a lift pitch. Yeah. And it would be called Titus.
Yeah.
And it would be about, bear with me, it would be about the history of Titus Salt, who was a devout Christian, was a politician, an MP, a philanthropist, industrialist. He's claimed to have brought people out of poverty in Bradford and give them housing and shelter, but he made them work long hours. He fed them well. He didn't allow them any alcohol. There's got to be a six-parter in that. If you can do Poldark, There's got to be something in Tattersall, has there?
Yeah. Unfortunately, you don't have a coastline here. So how can you do those shots of someone riding a horse slowly this way and then slowly?
It wouldn't be a horse, it would be a llama. It would be a llama.
Llama.
And just the sheer number of children that he had, you know, and all those different streets that were named after them. But anyway, I just think that's got to be. And we were really shortchanged. I know that people have heard me say this before. Sally Wainwright did a biopic of the Brontes. And because she was so busy doing Happy Valley and Last Tango in Halifax, it was a one-off, hour and 20 minutes. How can you tell the story of the lives in the Brontes in an hour and 20 minutes? We were shortchanged.
Yes.
So again, I think someone needs to revisit that and the radical writing that they did as women at that time. You know, there's so many things in Yorkshire to grapple with. Never mind Birmingham and gangsters.
One of the reasons I'm a writer is that my mum read Wuthering Heights to me when I was too young to understand it. And the wonderful thing is I can still remember the sound that the branch makes on the window. Even as a kid, those images that I got, and then she took me up to Haworth, and then actually I went on a horse once and rode up to the place that's supposed to be Wuthering Heights itself, the ruined cottage. So it's always been an iconic book for me, a very important book, and I would love to write about the Brontes. Yeah, that's good.
I know I didn't tell you about this, but let me just unpack it. So we are completely honoured at having you back here in Bradford as a Bradfordian. So we would like to present you with the Bradford. This is the Bradford Award for Film and Television. It's a City Hall clock tower, so I hope you'll accept that. There's even a nice certificate to go with it, just in case you have to explain to people what it is.
What it is.
Would you once again please give a really warm hand for Michael?